Megan's coming to us, an assistant professor in plant biology at the University of Georgia. This is her research that we're engaging with here, exploring ecology and evolution of wild plant populations, with an emphasis on their response to climate change. Megan's been hugely instrumental in the development of this tipping point lesson and helped curate, publish the data that we'll engage with and explore tomorrow. So Megan, just thanks so much for making this happen and for being here today. And we have an awesome group here that is excited to learn more about your work from you, and potentially ask some questions of you.
Okay, right. Well, thank you so much for being a part of this workshop, and John, of course, for organizing all of it. I'm really excited for the chance to meet all of you and talk a little bit more about the project, hear your thoughts and ideas. And sounds like things have gone a little bit long today, so I'm normally a little long-winded as well, but I'm going to try to be a bit more concise. I just have a couple slides to kind of share some additional information on the project, but also please feel free to jump in at any point with questions or comments. I'm also happy to answer any comments at the end. So as you can see here, this is kind of my standard opening slide for most presentations I give on this plant because it's got just a big, beautiful moss campion plant in full flower right in the front here. And of course, this is the star of the show, but I wanted to start off a little bit more big picture and talk about kind of tundra in general and why this species is so important for understanding tundra ecosystems. So we can define tundra as a type of biome that is too cold, and also the summers are just too short for trees to be able to survive in this environment. So essentially it's defined by the absence of trees. And so when we see photographs of tundra, they often look like this quite a barren or stark and harsh environment. And this is just one type of biome, similarly to how we might talk about a desert biome or a rainforest biome. We can think about a tundra biome, so a type of environment that determines the plants and animals that can exist there. We can ask, where on the planet do we find tundra? And there are kind of two different types of places. Essentially, we find it in incredibly cold areas. And so this tends to be very high latitudes close to the poles. So on this map, we'll see a lot of tundra in the Arctic Circle in places like Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Scandinavia. But we'll also find tundra at very high elevations on the top of very tall mountains. So in mountain ranges such as the Rocky Mountains, the Andes, or the Himalayan mountains, for example. And so for this reason, we can talk about sort of two general types of tundra. So we find tundra in Arctic areas. These are areas that are very high in latitude. So this is an example of one of our research sites at Toolik Lake in Arctic Alaska. And even though it's relatively low elevation, it's so far north that it is sufficiently cold and the summers are really quite short, and so it's not able to support trees. And so we see this completely treeless landscape here. But then we also find tundra in the alpine on the tops of mountains. And so this is a photograph of one of our sites in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And here we have to go to a much higher elevation in order to get those same tundra conditions. So we're at about 9,500 feet elevation here. And yet superficially, these environments look quite similar. They both are sort of above, beyond tree line, beyond the limit where trees are able to grow. And because of these incredibly cold conditions, very long cold winters, and very short summer seasons, the plants and animals that you'll find in tundra habitats are really well adapted to harsh climates and able to tolerate very cold temperatures. And, when looking at tundra from a distance, it can look like this sort of stark landscape. But if you ever do find yourself in a tundra habitat, I would encourage you to kind of kneel down, get real close to the ground, and look really closely. And you'll see that there is a really amazing diversity of plant life that has adapted to these really cold conditions. They just all happen to be sort of low to the ground. So you have to kind of kneel down and get down in there to notice all the different types of plants that are growing in this area. This is just another example of some common tundra wildflowers that we would find. One thing that they all have in common is that instead of growing upright, like you would think kind of a traditional plant is going to grow vertically, these plants are actually growing outward horizontally, and they're forming these sort of mats along the ground. And so they really only get to be a couple inches above the ground at most. And this is where their sort of common name comes from. These plants are often called cushion plants because they resemble these little sort of cushions just right on the ground. And of course, in the center here, I've put moss campion, our focal species that we've been intensively studying. And this is where the common name for this species comes from, because when it's not flowering, when it doesn't have all these beautiful pink flowers on it, it really does resemble just moss on the ground. And so that's where that common name of moss campion comes from. And you might wonder, well, why are all of these tundra plants have evolved to grow this horizontal strategy instead of vertically? And this is an important adaptation for dealing with these really harsh cold climates. So one advantage of staying low to the ground is that these plants are able to be covered pretty effectively by snow in the winter. And snow, if you've ever kind of built a little snow cave for yourself, is an effective insulator. And so it will keep the temperature really close to right around freezing and will protect these plants from experiencing the much, much colder air temperatures that are happening in the winter. And then even after the snow melts, staying low to the ground is an advantage because it protects these plants from wind chill. So if you've ever been outside on a really cold day where there's a lot of wind, you may have noticed that if you're standing up, you feel really exposed to that cold wind, but if you kind of huddle down close to the ground, you'll feel more protected and it feels warmer. And that's essentially what these plants are doing by staying low to the ground. So one of the common questions we get is sort of why this particular species, what makes moss campion interesting? There are just a couple things I wanted to highlight here. One is that this species of plant, even though it's relatively small, it actually lives or is capable of living for hundreds of years. And we know that because we have carefully recorded their survival rates. So we see that plants have extremely high survival from year to year on average. And we've also carefully measured how quickly they can grow. And they grow incredibly slowly, like a few millimeters a year. And so using that, when we find a rather large plant, we can estimate the minimum number of years that it would have taken for a plant to grow to be that big. And this has been really useful. This species has actually been used by geologists to date geological features, because if they find moss campion growing in an area, they can take kind of the largest plants that they can find and know that this ground has been exposed for at least as long as it would take moss campion to have grown that big. Another interesting thing about moss campion is its adaptations to deal with really extreme cold. So it actually makes antifreeze compounds in its leaves that protect that leaf tissue during the winter and allow it to tolerate very extreme cold temperatures. So leaf tissue in the dead of winter, when it has all these antifreeze compounds, can actually survive down to minus 30 degrees Celsius. It's a pretty impressive adaptation. And finally, moss campion is a species that we call a nurse plant, meaning that it provides a really nice microhabitat that supports all kinds of other species to be able to grow in this environment. So lots of other plants actually grow out of these moss campion cushions because moss campion leaves form these slightly warmer, wetter microenvironments that allows the seeds of other species to be able to germinate and these other plants to grow. And so you'll often find a moss campion plant here with several other species just growing right out of the middle of it. And of course, it's easiest to see this effect for other plants, but other studies have shown that moss campion has a beneficial protective effect for insects and also even microbes. So there's more insect diversity and microbial diversity right around moss campion plants than we find away from this species. But one of the problems really facing tundra plants and animals right now is rapid global climate change. So I put in here just a map of recent changes in temperature from 1990 to 2020. And one thing that is really highlighted on this map is some of the most substantial changes in temperature have been happening in the Arctic. So the Arctic is warming very, very quickly. And we can see that ourselves by comparing photographs of tundra areas from the past to what we see today. So, for example, these are two pictures of the same glacier, the Jackson Glacier, in Glacier National Park in Montana in 1911 versus 2009. And so we can see that this area has changed really substantially in that period of time. A large portion of the glacier has melted, and of course, that's going to change this immediate environment for the plants and animals that grow there. It's going to be warmer, drier, and there's new kind of substrate or ground available that plants and animals may be able to grow in. One of the real challenges facing tundra plants and animals specifically is that they may have nowhere to go in the future to be able to stay in the kinds of cold temperatures that they have adapted to. So this is a photograph just showing the alpine tundra region and mountain. You can see sort of tree line below, which is defining the start of the tundra biome, and our alpine plants and animals here. And while species that may occur below tree line in this forest area, they may be able to just move up in elevation as it gets warmer in order to find those colder temperatures that they need. But alpine plants and animals are already sort of at the tops of these mountains. So they're already in kind of the coldest places on the planet. So there's no sort of place that they can move as the earth gets warmer to be able to still be in those cold temperatures. So because of this, climate change is posing a huge challenge for Arctic and alpine tundra plants. And again, that's happening because climate is changing so fast in Arctic and alpine ecosystems. These are species that are already near the poles or at the tops of mountains, so there's nowhere really for them to go as it gets warmer. And many of these species are very long-lived. So as I mentioned, moss campion can live for hundreds of years. And so this rapid climate change is really happening within just 1 or 2 generations for many of these species. So really happening just in the blink of an eye, sort of from their perspective. And finally, these are species that are adapted for extreme cold, and so we don't know how they may react to warmer temperatures. So that's kind of the motivation and setting for our long-term study, where we have studied moss campion across its latitudinal range in North America. So we have sites from Arctic Alaska, which is about as far north as it occurs, down to northern New Mexico, which is just as far south as we can find it. And again, it's only growing on the very tallest mountains that far south. And this project was started by my collaborators, Bill Morris here, who's at Duke University, and Dan Doak at the University of Colorado. They started this study in 1995. I was not involved. I was 8 years old at the time, but they started monitoring these plants. And this is a picture of them in 2005 celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the study. They hiked a bottle of champagne up to one of their field sites, and they're sort of toasting each other here. And then I joined the project, and this is a picture of all three of us in 2015 celebrating the 20-year anniversary of the study. And then most recently, Meredith Zettelmoyer, who is an assistant professor at the University of Montana, has joined. And as John mentioned, we just found out we have funding for at least another 5 years to keep this going. And so she is going to be involved with making that happen. And essentially, what we're doing, we like to joke that we're like the US Census Bureau for tundra plants. We have these sites where we have all of the plants marked and given a unique ID. So you might be able to see here this tag. This is plant number 301. We have plant number 302, plant number 303 right next to it. So every year we come, metaphorically knocking on the door and relocating the exact same plants and asking, are they still alive from the last year? If so, how much have they grown, or perhaps have they shrunk in size? And then most importantly, how much have they reproduced? How many seeds did they make in this last year? And then we also look to find any new seedlings that have germinated in this area. So you might be able to see in this picture, we have some plastic toothpicks here that are marking seedlings that we have found that we're going to continue to track. And we also have data loggers that monitor the soil moisture and the temperature of these sites year round. So that allows us to get really good climate data. So I just wanted to show some pictures, because I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, what these different sites look like, going from the Arctic all the way down to New Mexico. So this is our farthest north site on the north slope of Arctic Alaska. This is tundra that is underlain by permafrost, so only the top couple inches of soil thaw out every year for these plants to be able to grow. And so it's quite wet and vegetated year round. And this site, Tuluk here, is part of an international group of Arctic research stations. So I just wanted to show this map, this sort of looking down on the globe from the North Pole. And you can see the Tuluk research station here is in northern Alaska, but we have similar Arctic research stations around the world that are really important for Arctic biologists to be able to study Arctic tundra plants and animals. So for example, we had sort of a side project for a couple years monitoring moss campion at Abisko, Sweden, as a comparison of what it's doing in Alaska. And this is just a picture of the Tuluk Lake field station. Lots of this infrastructure is so important for Arctic biologists to be able to work and study here, because It is a very barren landscape, and so we kind of need the support of this field station to be able to work here. Our other site is in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, which is in southeast Alaska. This is a mountain range a bit higher in elevation. And just wanted to show a picture of sort of what these sites look like. For scale, you can see our tents down here in this area. And I took this picture from the place that we hike to do all of our cooking. That's part of our grizzly bear safety protocol. We don't cook near where we sleep. And so I am definitely a coffee drinker. And so for me, having to hike up a mountain first thing in the morning in order to make myself a cup of coffee is my least favorite part of working at this site, but it is just really beautiful. And another perk is that if you kind of face the other direction, we get to see just a beautiful view of the Kennecott Glacier that runs right through here. And then at this time of year in the summer, at this latitude, this is about as dark as it gets at sunset. I think we took this picture at about 9 p.m. So that's about as dark as it gets. And then farther south, of course, we're starting to work at higher elevations in the tundra. So this is a photo of Niwot Ridge, which is in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. This is also an important field station, not just for the University of Colorado, but for researchers from lots of different areas. And in the summer, it's quite busy. You could see different teams of researchers out here studying all kinds of things from the marmot population to the snowpack. So again, another really important area for alpine research. And lastly, our farthest south site is in the Latier Peaks Wilderness in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico. This is our highest elevation area because it is so far south. We really only find tundra at elevations above 12,000 feet. And even then, it is our warmest and driest site. So as I mentioned, each year we go back to these sites, we relocate every single plant, and we record those important rates of survival, growth, and reproduction. And at this point, we have over 79,000, I just updated this morning, kind of blew my mind, 79,000 data points on what different plants are doing each year. So what have we learned over 20 plus years monitoring the same plants? So again, I think, picture's worth 1,000 words. So I wanted to just show some photographs of the exact same plant when we revisit it for 3 years in a row. And so this is one of our plants in one of our sites in 2003, in 2004, and in 2005. So it survived each of those years. And I mentioned the survival rate of the species is pretty high. You might also notice that it didn't change very much in size. I mentioned this is an incredibly slow growing species, and you can see it is essentially the exact same size each of those 3 years. But what we do see changing a lot is the reproduction of this species. So in 2003, this individual had 4 fruits, one here, 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 and here. And of course, that's the part of the plant that holds all of the seeds. So, that's a pretty good level of reproduction. But the very next year, it has 18 fruits. So it produced many, many more seeds than the year before. But then the very next year in 2005, it has 0 fruits. So no reproduction whatsoever. And this really got us very interested in what is driving this variation in reproduction. What exactly is different from 2004 to 2005, for example, where we see such a dramatic change in the reproduction of this plant. And that's where our climate data comes in. So I just wanted to show a picture of what this raw data looks like. So I mentioned we have temperature loggers that record the soil temperature every 4 hours. This is an example of what that looks like for one logger over 1 year. And from this data, we can calculate all kinds of different variables that kind of summarize the climate of a particular year. For example, you see this point in the data where the temperature stays really constant and it stays right around 0 degrees Celsius. So it's staying very close to freezing and the temperature is not changing very much from day to night. And that's a good indication that there is a protective snow layer on the site at that time that's insulating it and holding the temperature very constant and close to freezing. And so when we see that the temperature suddenly increases and we get these big swings between day temperature and night temperature, that tells us that that snow has melted away. And we're now just exposed to the air temperatures. And so from that, we're able to calculate the day that the snow has melted, but also other things like the mean temperature in the summer or the maximum temperature in the summer. And from this, one of the things we found that is really important is the average temperature in July. And July is the month where these plants are doing a lot of growing, they're flowering, and they're also maturing fruits. And so we've seen a big effect of July temperature on that rate of reproduction. So if we look at kind of the colder temperatures in our data set, we see that plants are able to have some reproduction, but that increases quite a bit as temperatures get warmer. These plants actually seem to be benefiting from warmer temperatures up to a point. But then we see this really sharp tipping point where all of a sudden we see the reverse, where reproductive rates go way down if the temperatures go above 16 degrees Celsius. And so that was a really surprising and interesting finding for us, that we see this kind of benefit of warming up to a point, but then a really sharp tipping point where all of a sudden reproduction rate goes down quite a lot. I just wanted to quickly kind of share, since I mentioned that we can calculate snow melt, that we see a similar pattern if we look at reproduction rate versus when snow melts at these different sites. So here, snow melt is expressed as just the day of the year. So lower numbers are earlier in the spring and later numbers are later in the summer. So we can see that when sites melt out very, very late, reproduction is sort of low. Reproduction is highest at sort of an intermediate level of snowmelt, but with climate change, snow is starting to melt out earlier and earlier in the spring. And again, we're seeing that reproduction rates are decreasing with those early snowmelt dates. And in fact, in our farthest south site in New Mexico, we've seen some years with very, very early snowmelt where we have essentially zero reproduction happening in that population. And so that's really concerning to see this sort of reproductive failure happening in these years with very early snowmelt or very high temperatures. So one thing I wanted to emphasize here is, because this is such a long-term project, we have been sort of surprised by things we found. We've, shifted our thinking about things as we've learned more. And so we're really approaching the scientific method as an ongoing process. So, we think of this as, when we make an observation, we think of interesting questions, and that leads to hypotheses. So for example, we make the observation that climate is changing really rapidly in Arctic and alpine areas. And we might wonder, how is that affecting these plants that are adapted to such cold temperatures? And we formulate a hypothesis. I think our initial hypothesis would have been that maybe they would actually benefit from warmer temperatures if if the environment is limiting by being so cold. We can test that by collecting our data. And when we see this data, we find evidence for this tipping point where, there's a benefit to a point, but then a really sharp decline. And so that has caused us to kind of refine our understanding of the system and develop new predictions or new hypotheses. So now we're interested in questions like, is the tipping point exactly the same in all the different places where we're studying Moss Campion? How can we think about temperature and snowmelt together? What exactly is the mechanism causing this tipping point? And so it is really never ending. You get one answer and it leads to 10 new questions. So as I sort of hinted at, a lot of where our thinking is now is trying to understand the why. We see that climate is having a really important effect on reproduction in this plant, and that it's not just a linear increase or decrease, it really is this sort of tipping point pattern. So why is reproduction failing? There are two sort of hypotheses that we're exploring. They could both be true. Neither of them could be true. We don't quite know yet. But one possibility is that as it gets warmer,
Hey,
plants.
Megan,
Yeah.
do you mind if I interrupt you right here and we don't go too much further with this because we're gonna kind of play around with this tomorrow?
Okay, perfect.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, no, no.
Um,
Actually, this was my
but
last slide, so it's a great place to.
okay, cause at the risk of some of the exploration tomorrow, we're gonna be kind of considering what's going on with reproduction, what's going on with flowering. So
Okay.
I just wanted to we want us to kind of have that experience tomorrow, and then when we bring you back in, we'll dive into this if that's okay with you.
Yes, yes, of course. And I'm
Sorry
yeah,
to,
I'm really excited to chat with all of you tomorrow and hear your ideas on this because it is very much something I'm thinking a lot about still too.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. If you're okay hanging around, I just want to say a few more things about tomorrow, and then it's the top of the hour, and folks may have to run, and that's fine. But if you're okay, there might be a few folks that would want to ask questions of you,
Oh, of
if that's
course,
all right.
yeah.
Okay. So we're about at time. Again, I'm sorry for being a little long this morning, which led to kind of this being late at each point thereafter. I wanted to say a couple of things. One, just as I was alluding to, tomorrow we have an awesome data set collected by Megan and her colleagues that we're going to play around with in a data analytics tool called CodeApp. And so Kristen is going to lead that. She's an expert in facilitating these data exploration experiences each time Elise and I participate in these workshops. We're in awe of some of the strategies that we learn and some of the takeaways that we come away with. And so really excited. That's kind of the new thing that we'll be experiencing tomorrow, along with another opportunity to hear from Megan, ask questions of Megan, and we'll engage with a virtual field trip to one of Megan's field sites. If you could um, also, as part of the workshop, we're asking folks to complete some work and respond to some reflection prompts and some feedback prompts. So in the chat right now, there is a link to a feedback and submission form where there are some feedback questions, reflection questions, and an opportunity for you to upload the student worksheet that you completed on your own today. So if that is something that you hand wrote, maybe you can take some pictures of that and upload it to the document or scan it. If you were typing into a tipping point worksheet, perhaps you can download that, save it as a PDF, and upload it to that form as well. So there's that form in there, some questions, and a spot to upload your student worksheet. Again, today, we went through this scaffolded structured data puzzle lesson. in the context of this tipping point Megan and her colleagues have discovered with moss campion and moss campion reproduction rates. And tomorrow we'll look at a few more variables, environmental factors that might be contributing to some of the patterns we see with moss campion reproduction rates. There's nothing to print for tomorrow. We'll be in this same Zoom room, same time, 9 a.m. Mountain Time to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And I'm really looking forward to it. So that form is in the chat. If you are all done, make sure you leave with, I'll email out with that form as well, but make sure you are putting in that information in the form. You're free to leave. If you want to stay on and ask a few questions of Megan, please feel free to do that. Elise, Kristen, am I missing anything? All right. Thanks all. Megan, I'm gonna just throw a couple at you. Folks, you're free to leave if you would like, or you're free to stay on and get some of your questions answered. The first question, Megan, that I saw was from Shannon. How do these seeds spread? Is it from birds? Is it from spores? What's going on?
That's a great question. They don't have any special adaptation for dispersal, like maple seeds have wings or dandelion seeds are like clearly for wind dispersal. They're just kind of your basic seed. So we do, when we look for new seedlings, we record how far they are from kind of the nearest reproductive plant. And from that, we see that the majority of seeds don't spread very far at all. They just kind of seem to fall kind of right around the mother plant. But clearly, some seeds are traveling longer distances. So we think it's wind, it could be water when the snow melts. And in terms of really long distance travel, I would guess it would have to be birds. We don't have any direct observations of that, but we do know that, this species has spread around the Arctic Circle, basically. So it has traveled long distances. So there must be some rare, very long distance seed movement.
Cool. Thanks, Megan. And you're not counting the seeds, you're counting the fruits. Have you ever counted the number of seeds in a fruit, or can you see them near the plant?
That's a great question. Yeah, so the vast majority of the time for kind of our core data, we're just counting the number of fruits. That's just a time limitation thing. So we do know that on average there are 8 to 14 seeds per fruit. So we're using the number of fruits as sort of a proxy for how many seeds total there are. And that's necessary because on the largest plants in a good year, we can have hundreds of fruits, and we do count every single one of those fruits. But if we had to count every single seed, we would be there forever. But we have done a couple smaller scale experiments where we've like added additional pollen to some flowers, and we've looked to see if those flowers then make more seeds than a flower that we didn't add pollen to, for example. So we see a little bit of variation in the number of seeds themselves.
Thanks, Megan. And when you're going up and counting these fruits, are you targeting the same week each year, or how are you deciding when to go up there and count these fruits?
More or less. Yeah, so we usually are in New Mexico and Colorado, sort of right at the end of July. I'm actually leaving on Tuesday to head out to do the censuses for this year in Colorado and New Mexico. And then we head up to Alaska afterwards, and we're doing the Alaska work usually right at the end of July, right in the beginning of August. So we do have to do it sequentially in that order, and we try to keep it more or less the same each year.
Thanks, Megan. And there was a question about, there's a huge latitudinal gradient here. Are the moss campion plants genetically similar across this latitudinal gradient?
That's a great question. So there's been a couple genetic studies on the species, and probably the most striking difference is between the Colorado, New Mexico plants seem to be distinct from the Arctic Circle plants. And we think that's because of the history of glaciation, that basically those more southern populations were sort of cut off at some points in time, and they're a bit more distinct. And then in some of the European parts of the range, there's some debate about whether there might be some subspecies or not. So that it seems to be more genetic diversity sort of in like the Scandinavian area than we see in like Alaska, Canada, Rocky Mountains area.
Cool. And there's a question about Chile. Have you seen, are these moss campion plants in the southern hemisphere and as far south as Chile?
They aren't actually. So I think that is a limitation to seed dispersal. I'll bet if they could get there, they would be able to grow, I would guess. But yeah, they don't occur there.
Speaking about growing these plants, have you ever been able to grow these moss campion plants in a lab? Joyanne is from Alaska and she's thinking about cloudberries, which she's saying have never been able to be recreated and grown in a garden or in a lab, and she's wondering if that's the same for moss campion.
We can germinate the seeds pretty readily, but they do grow slowly. If we put them in pretty unnatural conditions, just give them a ton of fertilizer and kind of warmer temperatures, they'll grow a little bit faster, but interestingly, they grow more diffusely and they don't look like the tight little kind of cushion that we would find in nature. So we haven't done that for the sake of science because we feel like at that point the conditions they're in are so artificial that we're not sure we're actually saying anything about what they would do in the wild. But that's a challenge of working with such a long-lived species, is there are a lot of questions that we would love to answer, that we could answer if we could just do an experiment. But because it lives so long, they're basically like mini trees. It's pretty hard to do a controlled experiment with them.
Yeah, Joyanne, thanks for the question. And yeah,
Yeah.
Megan, thanks for the response. And I'm gonna end it here.